December 1944. The snow fell heavy over the shattered forests of Belgium. The Battle of the Bulge had turned the European front into chaos. The German army was on the offensive, roaring back with a fury no one had expected. Convoys burned in the night. Towns vanished under shell fire. And deep inside that frozen nightmare, one American soldier, a man his own comrades called reckless, even crazy, made a decision that would defy orders, defy reason, and save hundreds of lives. His name was Corporal Thomas Doyle, a 24-year-old tank destroyer gunner from Chicago. He wasn't a hero in the making. He was the kind of soldier who drank too much coffee, cracked jokes at the wrong time, and never took orders too seriously. But on that day, when his regiment was ambushed by a hidden German panzer unit, Doyle would do something that no manual, no strategy, and no sane man could have ever planned. As smoke and snow mixed into a blinding storm, he climbed into his burning M10 tank destroyer, engine aflame, ammunition cooking off, and drove straight toward the enemy armor column, alone. His crew screamed for him to stop. Command yelled to fall back. But Doyle only grinned through the flames and shouted, "If I'm going out, I'm taking them with me." That final charge, a suicidal run into the jaws of destruction, became one of the most astonishing acts of bravery in the Battle of the Bulge. The story was almost lost to time, until survivors of the 18th Infantry finally told what they saw that day. This is that story, the tale of the man they called Crazy, whose one deadly attack turned the tide of a hopeless battle. Snow fell like ashes from the heavens as the 18th Infantry Regiment dug into the frozen soil of the Ardennes. It was December 17, 1944. Just one day after the Germans had launched their surprise counter-offensive, a thunderous assault that would come to be known as the Battle of the Bulge. The once quiet Belgian woods now echoed with the distant rumble of tank treads and the sharp crack of artillery. What had been a routine defensive line the week before had turned into hell overnight. The men of the 18th had been caught off guard, completely unprepared for the ferocity of the German attack. Radio lines were cut, maps were useless, and visibility had dropped to almost nothing. A thick fog rolled in from the valleys, mixing with smoke from burning trucks and the acrid stench of cordite. Snow clung to every branch and uniform, turning the soldiers into pale ghosts in an endless white wasteland. Corporal Thomas Doyle huddled behind the gun shield of his M10 tank destroyer. Nicknamed Betty Lou, he rubbed his numb hands together, trying to feel anything through his frozen gloves. His breath fogged in the air as he looked through the periscope, nothing but white and grey. His crew sat in tense silence inside the steel coffin, listening to the rumble of distant engines that grew louder by the minute. "Sounds like they've got armor," muttered the loader. Private Givens, his voice shaking. "They've got everything," Doyle replied flatly. He had that calm tone his men recognized, not because he wasn't scared, but because he knew there was no point in showing it. Doyle had fought in Italy, in the hedgerows of France, and he'd seen fear eat men alive before a bullet ever did. Outside, American infantry moved frantically, repositioning machine guns and setting up roadblocks. Officers barked orders into dead radios, cursing the static. A truck exploded somewhere down the road, a plume of black smoke twisting into the grey sky. The reality of it hit everyone at once. They were cut off, surrounded, and the Germans were closing in fast. The first mortar rounds came without warning. The ground shook, showering the M10 with dirt and snow. Doyle ducked instinctively as shrapnel pinged off the armor. "Driver, start her up," he shouted. The engine roared to life with a sputtering growl. The gunner adjusted his sights, scanning for targets through the mist. Then they saw it, a shape moving in the fog, low and massive. A German Panther tank, target front. "Range 200 yards, Doyle ordered. The M10's 3-inch gun thundered, the recoil slamming through the hull. The shell streaked through the snow and struck the Panther square in the turret. A bloom of orange fire erupted as the enemy tank halted, its crew scrambling to escape before it detonated. For a brief moment, a cheer rose from the Americans along the line. But it was short-lived. More silhouettes appeared through the fog. 2, 5, 10, and then more. German armor rolled forward in perfect formation, followed by waves of infantry in white winter smocks. They moved like phantoms, methodical and unstoppable. It wasn't a skirmish anymore, it was an avalanche. "Christ almighty," whispered Givens. "There's dozens of them, load armor piercing." Doyle barked. "Keep firing!" They fired again and again, each shell followed by a deafening explosion. The M10's gun glowed red-hot, smoke filling the compartment. Outside, tracer rounds sliced through the air. Her shell struck near their position, flipping a nearby jeep and killing 2 soldiers instantly. Screams mingled with the roar of engines and the hiss of burning fuel. The German artillery zeroed in. Every second, the forest lit up with fire. Over the radio, the regimental command tried to coordinate a retreat, but the signals were jammed. All Doyle heard was static and fragments of voices. The road behind them was blocked by destroyed vehicles. There would be no reinforcements. They were the only line standing between the German armored spearhead and the regiment's main camp a few miles back. Another shell slammed into the ground beside them, rocking the M10 violently. Sparks rained down from the ceiling. "We can't hold this," shouted the driver. "They'll overrun us in minutes." Doyle looked through the periscope again, jaw clenched. The German lead tank was less than 100 yards away now, its cannon slowly rotating toward them. The M10's armor was thin. One good hit would turn it into a furnace. He knew it. His crew knew it, but there was nowhere left to go. "Keep your eyes on that road," Doyle said quietly. "They get past us, the whole regiment's done." The loader's hands shook as he slid another shell into the breach. His breath came in ragged bursts. "Tommy, we're not stopping that many. We'll be scrap in 10 seconds. Doyle didn't answer right away. He just stared through the periscope, watching the dark column advancing. Dozens of tanks, trucks, half-tracks, all rumbling through the snow like a mechanical beast. Then he finally spoke, voice low but steady. "Then we make it count." The M10 fired again. The recoil slammed through Doyle's chest. Another explosion downrange. One more German tank crippled, but there were too many. He could see their machine guns flashing, their infantry spreading out through the trees. The air was alive with the scream of incoming rounds. One shell finally found its mark. The explosion rocked the M10, ripping through the engine compartment. Flames burst out of the rear vents. "We're hit!" someone yelled. The driver reached for the hatch. "We gotta bail." Smoke filled the cabin thick and choking. Doyle coughed, waving his hand in front of his face, but he didn't move. He was staring at the advancing tanks, and in that instant something changed in his eyes. That strange look his men had seen before, half madness, half determination, the kind that made him do things no sane man would. He knew the battle was lost if they stayed. He knew the Germans would tear through the American lines in minutes. And yet, deep inside the smoke-filled hull of that burning M10, Doyle began to think of something else, something insane, dangerous, maybe even impossible. His men were yelling to get out, but he didn't hear them anymore. The roar of the flames drowned everything out. His mind was somewhere else, already forming the plan that would go down in history, the plan that would make even his own comrades call him crazy. The forest around them was on fire now. Snow melted into black mud as the flames crept closer. German shells continued to fall, shaking the earth. But inside that steel coffin, Doyle's heartbeat slowed. He had made up his mind. He would not retreat. He would not surrender that road. And though no one could have guessed it then, that decision, made in the smoke and chaos of a hopeless fight, would change everything that followed. The smoke from the burning M10 mixed with the cold fog, turning the battlefield into a haunting grey blur. Doyle's men were coughing, eyes watering, trying to escape the inferno. The heat inside the tank destroyer was unbearable, ammunition clattering as the fire spread. "We have to get out now," yelled Givens, already climbing toward the hatch. The driver followed, kicking the top open and leaping into the snow, but Doyle stayed at his seat, staring through the periscope at the approaching German column. His hands gripped the controls like a man possessed. Outside, chaos reigned. American infantry were scattering from the roadside, diving into foxholes or running for cover through the trees. German shells tore through the lines, splintering trees and sending snow and dirt flying. In the distance, Doyle could see the silhouettes of Panthers and half-tracks advancing through the mist, their engines roaring, their machine guns sweeping left and right. Every few seconds, the air cracked with the sound of a new explosion. Doyle knew there was no time to reload or repair. The M10 was crippled, its engine destroyed, its armor burning, but the gun still worked. That 3-inch cannon at the heart of the machine could still fire, and that was all he needed. "Tommy, what the hell are you doing?" Givens shouted from outside, his voice barely audible over the chaos. Doyle ignored him. He slammed the breech closed on one last shell and swung the turret manually, groaning under the strain. The gears creaked and clanked, smoke rising all around him. The heat scorched his face, but he didn't stop. The lead Panther tank came into view, its iron cross barely visible through the haze. Doyle lined up the sights. His breathing slowed. He could feel his heartbeat in his ears, his pulse steady despite the inferno surrounding him. He whispered to himself, "Come on, come on." And then he fired. The cannon roared like thunder. The shell streaked across the clearing, a blinding flash in the fog. A second later it hit. The Panther's turret erupted in flames, its top hatch blowing off as smoke poured from the wreck. The explosion lit the fog with a ghostly glow. German soldiers nearby dove for cover, shouting commands in panic. Doyle gritted his teeth, grabbed another shell and reloaded by hand, his gloves smoking from the heat. The loader was gone. It was just him now. He jammed the round into the breech and aimed again. This time he targeted a troop carrier further back. Another boom. Another hit. The truck went up in flames, ammunition cooking off inside. Outside, the Americans saw what was happening. Through the snow and fire, they could see the silhouette of the burning M10 still fighting up, alone. "That's Doyle!" someone shouted. "He's still in there!" For a moment, the panicked line regained its courage. Men who had been retreating stopped, turned back and began firing their rifles and machine guns again. The sight of one burning tank destroyer holding its ground against an entire German column was enough to stiffen every spine. But Doyle wasn't thinking about glory. He wasn't thinking about medals or legends. He was just trying to buy time. He knew the Germans would break through any minute now, but every second they spent stopping to deal with him was another second for his regiment to fall back and regroup. A round struck the M10 square in the side, tearing through the armor and slamming Doyle against the gun shield. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs. He felt something warm on his side and blood. Still, he forced himself upright, coughing through the smoke. His ears rang from the impact, but the world around him seemed to move in slow motion. He loaded another shell and fired again. Another German vehicle went up in flames. The whole valley now glowed with fire and smoke, a hellish red under the falling snow. German officers were shouting, trying to coordinate their men, but Doyle's relentless fire was sowing chaos. Tanks were maneuvering awkwardly on the narrow road, colliding, blocking each other's path. A lucky shot from a Sherman further back hit another German tank, adding to the confusion. The enemy formation was breaking apart, not destroyed but slowed, disoriented. Exactly what Doyle needed. Inside the burning M10, flames licked at his boots. The ammunition rack was almost empty now, just 2 shells left. His hands were shaking from exhaustion, his eyes stinging from the smoke. His mind flickered with thoughts of home. His wife in Kansas, his little boy who'd be starting school soon. For a brief moment he allowed himself a weak smile. "Just hold on a little longer," he muttered, loading the second-to-last round. The gun fired again and another explosion echoed through the forest. German infantry were now returning fire directly at the M10, bullets pinging off its scorched hull. A grenade landed near the tracks, detonating and showering the tank in dirt. Doyle barely noticed. He was down to his last shell. He placed it into the breech slowly, almost reverently. His movements were mechanical now, each one driven by instinct. He turned the gun one last time, aiming at the largest German tank he could see, a Tiger I, its massive gun barrel cutting through the smoke like a spear. Doyle exhaled once. Then he pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed his shoulder back, and for a split second there was silence. And then the Tiger exploded, its fuel tanks igniting in a spectacular burst of flame. The blast lit up the fog like dawn breaking through night. The German column halted completely. Men shouted, pointing at the burning wrecks, disbelief etched across their faces. Then came the second explosion, from inside the M10 itself. The fire had reached the remaining ammunition. The blast ripped the turret apart, sending debris into the sky. The tank destroyer was gone. For a few moments there was nothing but the crackle of fire and the muffled echo of distant gunfire. The German advance had stopped cold. Doyle's last shot, his final act, had bought the regiment the time it needed to pull back and reorganize. When the smoke cleared hours later, all that remained of Betty Lou was a smoldering wreck. Nearby, American troops who returned to the scene found only charred metal and the faint smell of oil and ash. One of them, a young private, removed his helmet and whispered, "He really was crazy. But God, he did it." And in that ruined clearing, surrounded by wrecked tanks and twisted steel, the story of Thomas Doyle, the crazy gunner of the Ardennes, was born. The smoke still hung low over the forest that night, curling through the shattered trees like a living ghost. The battle had moved on, but the echoes of it remained. Burned-out trucks, half-buried bodies, and the smell of cordite that clung to the air like a curse. The men of the 18th Infantry Regiment were exhausted, their faces blackened with soot, and their nerves frayed to the breaking point. They had fallen back several miles, regrouping near a small Belgian farmhouse that served as a temporary command post. The wounded were laid out on the frozen ground, medics working by lantern light, but amid the chaos, word was spreading like wildfire. The men were talking in hushed tones, passing around the same incredible story. The story of one gunner who stayed behind when everyone else fell back. "You hear about Doyle?" one corporal whispered. "They say he knocked out half a German column before his tank went up." Another replied, shaking his head, "No man could do that. Not alone." Yet even as doubt filled their voices, their eyes carried something else. Awe. Major Alan Rees, the regimental commander, listened silently as reports came in over the radio. Scouts confirmed the wreckage. Multiple German tanks and vehicles destroyed. The road littered with smoldering remains. It didn't seem possible. "Get me that name again," he said quietly to his adjutant. "Corporal Thomas Doyle, sir," came the answer. Rees nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward the dark tree line where the fighting had been. Then Doyle just saved every man in this regiment. The next morning, the Americans cautiously advanced back toward the site of the ambush. The snow had stopped falling, leaving behind a pale, silent world. They moved carefully, rifles raised, half expecting another German counterattack. But the forest was quiet, eerily quiet, and then they saw it. The M10 Betty Lou sat in the middle of the road, blackened and half buried in snow. Its gun barrel still pointed downrange, frozen in place. Around it lay the twisted wrecks of German vehicles, Panthers, half-tracks and supply trucks, their frames mangled and smoking. The road itself was cratered and scorched, the aftermath of one man's desperate stand. Private Givens was among the first to reach the wreck. He walked slowly toward the M10, his boots crunching in the frozen mud. The air still carried the acrid sting of burned fuel. He stopped a few feet away, staring up at what was left of the tank destroyer. Its turret had been blown off, its interior a blackened husk. Givens removed his helmet and just stood there, eyes glistening. He had tried to pull Doyle out. He had shouted, begged, even tried to climb back in. But Doyle had stayed. "Crazy bastard," he whispered under his breath. "You really did it." Nearby, medics and engineers moved through the wreckage, cataloging what was left. They found shell casings scattered around the vehicle, each one fired manually. That alone stunned them. Doyle had loaded, aimed, and fired every shot by himself. Judging from the number of destroyed enemy vehicles, he had fired at least 8 rounds before the tank went up. Each one a hit. Major Rees arrived not long after, his coat still dusted with snow. He stood beside the wreck, arms folded, studying the scene in silence. The destruction stretched for nearly a quarter-mile. Dozens of German soldiers dead, their vehicles smoldering in the pale light. It was impossible not to feel both horror and admiration. "They stopped them cold," Rees finally said. "One man did all this." The engineers found what was left of Doyle near the rear of the vehicle. He hadn't tried to escape. His hands were still clutching the gun mechanism, frozen in place by the heat of the fire. Someone placed a blanket over what was left of him. The men around the wreck removed their helmets. No words were spoken. None were needed. Later that day, as the regiment re-established its defensive line, talk of Doyle spread even further. Soldiers who had never met him were already calling him the crazy gunner. Some swore they had seen his burning M10 firing long after the explosion. Others said they heard his voice over the radio, calm and steady, telling the regiment to hold the line. Whether those accounts were true didn't matter. What mattered was the story, and how it made every man believe that even in the darkest moment, courage could turn the tide. As night fell, the surviving crews sat around small fires, their faces illuminated by flickering orange light. They spoke softly, sharing cigarettes and coffee, the sound of distant artillery rumbling somewhere far to the east. One of the new recruits, barely 18, stared into the flames and asked, was he really crazy? Givens, sitting across from him, didn't answer right away. He took a long drag from his cigarette, then exhaled slowly. Yeah, he said finally. Crazy enough to stay when the rest of us had to run. Crazy enough to save us all. In the days that followed, Doyle's story spread beyond the regiment. Word reached the division command, then higher still. His actions were pieced together from eyewitness accounts, and the aftermath left behind. A recommendation for the Medal of Honor was written up by Major Reese himself. The paperwork described how Corporal Doyle remained at his post under direct enemy fire, continuing to engage advancing enemy armor until his position was destroyed, thereby delaying the enemy advance and enabling the safe withdrawal of his regiment. But even as the army recorded it in neat military language, those who had been there knew the truth could never really be captured in words. What Doyle did wasn't about orders or duty. It was something deeper, something primal, a refusal to give in, even when reason said it was hopeless. In the weeks that followed, the regiment continued its fight through the Ardennes, pushing the Germans back inch by inch. Every time the men dug new positions, someone would mention Doyle's name. What would Doyle do? Became an unspoken rallying cry. It reminded them that one man's stand, no matter how desperate, could change everything. Months later, when spring finally came and the snow melted, the road where Betty Lou had made her last stand was cleared. A small wooden cross was placed beside the wreck, inscribed with a few simple words carved into it by hand. Here stood a gunner who would not yield. No medals could ever match that. No citation could ever capture the madness or the bravery that had burned inside that steel coffin. But for the men who survived because of him, Thomas Doyle wasn't just a name in a report. He was proof that courage, even the kind born from madness, could shape the course of history. In the weeks that followed Doyle's final stand, the forest slowly began to reclaim the battlefield. The snow melted into a thick grey slush that swallowed the remains of tanks and trucks alike. Charred trees stood like blackened bones, their trunks split open by artillery shells. To anyone passing through, the sight looked like a scar carved into the earth itself, a place where death had once ruled. But for the men of the 18th Infantry Regiment, that ground meant something more. It was where a single soldier had turned madness into heroism and despair into salvation. By late January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge had shifted decisively in the Allies' favor. Reinforcements had arrived, the German offensive was faltering, and the American lines, once broken and scattered, were now pushing back. The men who had survived Doyle's fight moved forward with hardened resolve, carrying the memory of his sacrifice like an invisible shield. Every firefight, every frozen march through the snow-covered woods, they remembered that one man who refused to run. Corporal Doyle's story spread beyond the 18th Regiment. Letters were sent up the chain of command, reports detailed his stand, and before long, his name reached the desks of higher officers. The account of his final battle was retold again and again, each time slightly different, each time more incredible. Some said he destroyed 10 tanks, others claimed 15. One report even insisted he continued firing after his M10 exploded, as if his spirit itself refused to die. In the chaos of war, myths and truth often blended together. But everyone agreed on one thing: whatever he did, it had saved hundreds of lives. Back home in a quiet Kansas town, a telegram arrived at a small farmhouse. It was addressed to Mrs. Evelyn Doyle. She had been living in hope and silence for months, waiting for any word from her husband. The message, printed in the clipped language of military dispatch, began with the words every soldier's wife dreaded: "We regret to inform you." Her knees buckled as she read it, and she clutched the paper against her chest, tears falling onto the ink. A few weeks later, another letter came, this one from Major Alan Reese himself. It wasn't official. It was personal. Handwritten on creased paper, it described her husband's final moments in words that the telegram could never capture. Reese wrote, "He stood his ground when others could not. He did not run, he did not falter. In the face of certain death, he fought so that others might live. We will never forget him. That letter would be passed down through her family for generations. In Europe, the remnants of Doyle's regiment continued their advance toward Germany. The Ardennes forests gave way to open plains and shattered towns, where the full scope of the war revealed itself. Columns of refugees, destroyed villages, and prisoners marching under grey skies. The men had grown colder, harder, but something in them had changed since that winter day. They no longer fought just to survive. They fought to honor the memory of those who hadn't. When the war finally ended in May 1945, celebrations erupted across the continent. But for the veterans of the 18th, there was no joy, only a deep, exhausted silence. They had seen too much to celebrate. Some gathered that evening near a campfire outside a liberated German town, passing around a bottle of whiskey, scavenged from a destroyed farmhouse. They laughed quietly, swapped stories, and when one of them mentioned Doyle's name, the firelight dimmed a little. "You think they'll ever tell it, right?" one of the younger soldiers asked. Private Givens, now thin and pale from months of fighting, took a slow sip before answering. "They'll tell it," he said softly, "but they'll never feel it. You had to be there, to see that fire, to hear that gun keep firing when the whole world was falling apart." He looked down at the bottle in his hand. "They'll call him crazy. They'll call him a hero, but me? I think he was just human. He did what no one else could because someone had to." There was a quiet nodding among the group. No one spoke after that. The wind whistled through the ruins of the nearby town, and the embers of the fire floated upward, like tiny sparks of memory trying to reach the sky. Months later, the army officially recognized Corporal Thomas Doyle's actions. The Medal of Honor was awarded posthumously, the citation reading that he displayed conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty, holding his ground against overwhelming enemy forces and sacrificing his life in defense of his unit. The medal was presented to Evelyn Doyle at a ceremony in Washington. The hall was filled with generals, reporters, and other soldiers' families, but Evelyn barely noticed them. Her eyes stayed on the medal, resting in its velvet box, gleaming under the stage lights. It was beautiful, but to her it was just metal. The man she loved was gone. After the ceremony, she stepped outside into the afternoon sun. The air was warm, and for the first time in years the world seemed peaceful. She looked up at the sky and whispered softly, "You weren't crazy, Tommy, you just cared too much." Meanwhile, in Europe, the men of Doyle's unit made a silent pact. Every year on December 17th, the anniversary of his last stand, they would light a candle for him no matter where they were. Some did it in their homes, others in churches, and a few even returned to Belgium years later. The road where Betty Lou burned was rebuilt, paved over, and traffic returned. But those who knew the story could never drive through that stretch of forest without slowing down, without remembering the man who once stood there alone. As decades passed, Doyle's name faded from official memory. History books mentioned him briefly, a paragraph here or there among the countless stories of World War II. But among soldiers, the ones who understood what it meant to face death and not flinch, his legend endured. They called him crazy because they couldn't comprehend that kind of courage. But those who lived because of him knew the truth. Thomas Doyle wasn't crazy. He was the embodiment of what every soldier hopes to be, brave enough to face the impossible, and selfless enough to give everything for others. And in that lonely patch of Belgian forest, where the snow still falls each winter, a single wooden cross stands in the clearing. The words carved into it have faded with time, but if you stand close enough, you can still make them out. One man stood, so others could live. When the smoke cleared, and the thunder of artillery finally faded, the battlefield was unrecognizable. What had once been a dense, snow-covered forest had turned into a wasteland of scorched trees and shattered steel. The scent of burning fuel and gunpowder hung heavy in the freezing air. For hours the forest had echoed with the roar of engines, the crack of gunfire, and the scream of shells. But now there was only silence, broken only by the crackle of distant fires and the faint groans of wounded men. Among that silence, a handful of American soldiers slowly rose from their positions. They were dazed, disoriented, their faces blackened by soot and streaked with sweat. The world around them looked like something out of a nightmare, a scene of destruction so complete that even victory felt hollow. Major Alan Reese stumbled forward, his leg bandaged hastily, his rifle hanging uselessly at his side. He looked out over the wreckage of the German convoy, their tank still smoldering, their tracks twisted and broken. And there, at the very center of it all, was the burnt-out husk of an American M10 tank destroyer, the vehicle that had once been Corporal Thomas Doyle's post. The machine was barely recognizable. Its turret had been blown apart, its armor melted and blackened. The snow around it had turned to mud and ash. Yet inside that ruin, Doyle's final act had changed everything. His last stand had halted the German advance, destroying several tanks and vehicles that had been moments away from overrunning the American line. The surviving men knew that if he hadn't held his ground, the entire regiment would have been wiped out. It was that realization, that haunting truth, which made their survival feel like both a miracle and a burden. Major Rees ordered a search of the wreckage. The men worked quietly, their boots sinking into the soft mud, their breath fogging in the cold air. They knew what they would find, but they searched anyway, not out of hope but out of respect. When they finally reached the tank, one soldier found what was left of Doyle. His body was slumped over the cannon, his hands still gripping the gun controls. The expression on his face was calm, eerily calm, as if he had made peace with what was coming. Rees stood there for a long moment, staring into the twisted steel, unable to speak. Finally he whispered, "He held them. He actually held them." Then, turning to his men, he said quietly, "Get him out of there. We're not leaving him behind." They carried Doyle's remains down the hill on a makeshift stretcher, moving slowly, solemnly. There was no flag to drape over his body, no priest to say words of comfort. Just weary soldiers trudging through the snow, each one thinking the same thing: they were alive because of him. That night, they buried him near the edge of the forest, beneath a shattered oak tree. The air was bitterly cold, the kind that froze tears before they could fall. The men gathered around the shallow grave, their rifles resting against their shoulders. No one spoke for a long while. Then Private Givens, Doyle's radio operator, stepped forward. He had barely spoken since the attack, his voice hollowed by grief. But now he found the strength to say something. He wasn't crazy, Givens said quietly. He just wouldn't quit. Not even when everything was gone. He paused, glancing toward the horizon, where faint orange light still flickered from the burning wrecks. We called him reckless. We said he'd get himself killed. But he didn't do this for glory. He did it for us. Every single one of us standing here, no one replied. They didn't need to. Each man felt the same deep ache, the same mixture of sorrow and pride. Major Rees reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small metal tag. Doyle's dog tag, blackened but still legible. He stared at it for a moment before placing it at the head of the grave. "He'll have his name," Rees said softly. "No one's going to forget what he did here." As they turned to leave, the wind picked up, scattering a few flakes of snow across the grave. The firelight from the wrecked vehicles danced across the trees, casting long flickering shadows. For a brief moment, it almost looked like the forest itself was paying tribute, whispering a final farewell to the man who had fought and died within it. The next morning, reinforcements arrived. When they saw the destruction, they could hardly believe what had happened. The German convoy had been completely annihilated. Dozens of tanks and vehicles were destroyed in a line stretching for nearly a mile. And yet somehow the American position had held. One officer, after hearing the story, simply shook his head in disbelief. "One man did all this?" he asked. Rees didn't answer. He just nodded, his eyes distant. Word of Doyle's stand began to spread through the ranks. At first it was just a story whispered around campfires, a tale of one gunner who refused to retreat. But soon it took on a life of its own. Soldiers in nearby units began referring to the spot as Doyle's Hill. Some said he had destroyed 15 tanks single-handedly. Others claimed 20. The details changed with each retelling, but the heart of the story remained the same. One man had turned the tide when all seemed lost. For the men who had fought beside him, however, it wasn't a legend, it was memory. They had seen the fire, heard the roar of his gun, and felt the shockwave of each shell he fired. They had watched a man make the ultimate choice, to stand and fight knowing he wouldn't survive. That memory burned into their minds deeper than any medal or story ever could. As the regiment moved on, leaving the Ardennes behind, they carried Doyle's spirit with them. Every time they set up a new position, every time they faced another German counterattack, someone would mutter under their breath, "Do it for Doyle." It became a quiet battle cry, not shouted, not ordered but remembered. War moves fast. Names fade. Graves disappear beneath the earth. But in that brutal winter of 1944, in a frozen forest halfway across the world, one man had made a stand that no one who survived it would ever forget. He may have been just a corporal, just another face in the endless line of soldiers who fought and died in World War II. But for the men he saved, Thomas Doyle was something more. He was proof that courage can be louder than fear, and that sometimes the line between madness and heroism is drawn by those who refuse to run. In the weeks following the battle, the snow in the Ardennes began to melt, revealing the scars of war that had been hidden beneath its white silence. The trees that had been blackened by fire stood like skeletons, their branches broken, their trunks riddled with bullet holes. Rusted helmets, twisted metal, and the remains of shattered vehicles lay scattered across the frozen ground, reminders of the chaos that had unfolded there. For the men of Major Reese's regiment, life moved forward, but the memory of that one fateful day never left them. When they were finally rotated off the front lines, the surviving soldiers gathered in a makeshift camp several miles from the battlefield. They were thinner now, harder, their eyes hollowed by exhaustion and grief. Letters home were written in quiet corners, but for many words failed. How do you explain to your family that a man they'd never met had saved your life by giving up his own? For some, the answer was silence. For others, it was storytelling. Private Givens, Doyle's radio operator, began writing about that day in a small, weathered notebook he carried in his pocket. Every night, he'd sit by the dim light of a lantern, describing the events as best he could, not as a report but as a memory. He wanted to remember the sound of Doyle's voice over the radio, the calmness that cut through the chaos, the way his hands never trembled even as shells fell all around them. Those pages, filled with dirt and smudged ink, would later become part of the official after-action report that chronicled what happened at Doyle's Hill. When the paperwork finally reached command, it caused a stir. A single tank destroyer holding off an entire German column. It sounded impossible. But the evidence was there. The wreckage, the shell casings, the destroyed enemy armor. The officers who investigated could hardly believe it. Reports described it as an act of extraordinary bravery and initiative under extreme duress. The recommendation for the Distinguished Service Cross was written in careful, formal language, but behind the words lay something rawer, something that could never truly be captured on paper. Weeks later, when the news finally reached Doyle's family back home in Kansas, his mother wept as she held the letter. The War Department's words were brief. "Your son, Corporal Thomas Doyle, displayed remarkable heroism in the face of overwhelming enemy force. His actions directly contributed to the survival of his unit." But to her the meaning was deeper than any medal or title. Her son, who had been called reckless, impulsive, even crazy by some of his comrades, had died a hero. Across Europe, as the Allies continued their push toward Germany, stories like Doyle's echoed through the ranks. Soldiers swapped tales of lone gunners, last stands, and impossible odds. It was part of how they coped, by remembering courage when the world seemed consumed by fear. For the men who had fought beside Doyle, however, the legend wasn't something distant or exaggerated. It was something they had lived through. Every time they heard artillery thunder in the distance, they remembered the sound of his gun firing again and again in defiance of death. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the surviving members of the regiment returned home. Some went back to farms, others to factories or classrooms, but all carried with them invisible scars. At reunions in the years that followed, the story of that day was told over and over, each time with the same reverent tone. There was laughter too, stories of Doyle's stubbornness, his terrible singing voice, his habit of gambling away his rations in poker games, but beneath the laughter, there was always that weight. In one of those reunions held in 1955, Major Reese, now retired, stood before a small group of grey-haired veterans. He held up a photograph of the regiment taken before the Battle of the Bulge. In the faded black and white image, Doyle stood in the back row, his grin wide, his arms slung around a fellow soldier. "He never thought of himself as a hero," Reese said quietly. "But maybe that's what made him one." Over time, the story of Doyle's stand spread beyond the regiment. A journalist writing a feature on the Battle of the Bulge came across the official report and published an article titled "The Mad Gunner of the Ardennes." The name stuck. Newspapers across the country ran variations of the story, some dramatized, others factual, and soon, the tale of the gunner who stopped a German convoy in 10 seconds became part of the greater mythology of American heroism during World War II. Decades later, historians would revisit the battle, poring over the records, the maps, and the testimonies of survivors. Some questioned the details: how many German tanks had actually been destroyed, how long the engagement really lasted. But those who had been there never doubted what they had seen. They didn't need numbers or diagrams. They had lived it. In the 1980s, a small memorial was erected near the site of the battle. It was simple: a stone marker engraved with the words, "In memory of Corporal Thomas Doyle and the men who stood with him. Their courage saved a regiment. Their sacrifice saved many." Every few years, veterans and their families would visit. Some brought flowers, others brought small mementos, a patch, a coin, a note. The forest had grown back, but if you stood quietly, you could still feel it. The weight of history in the air, the echoes of gunfire carried faintly by the wind. Even now, long after the last of those who fought there have passed away, the story endures. It's told in classrooms, in documentaries, and on YouTube channels dedicated to preserving the memory of those who lived through World War II. Viewers still find themselves moved by the tale of a young man who defied orders, defied fear and defied death, all to protect the men beside him. He was never meant to be famous. He wasn't a general or a pilot or a decorated ace. He was just one soldier among millions, caught in the machinery of a global war. But in that frozen forest, in the face of annihilation, Corporal Thomas Doyle became something greater than anyone expected. A symbol of the kind of courage that refuses to die. They had called him crazy. But history would call him something else entirely: a hero. And somewhere deep in the quiet woods of the Ardennes, where the snow falls soft and the trees whisper with the ghosts of the past, that hero spirit still lingers, unyielding, eternal, and forever brave.